I feel like we're describing something. You're touching on something where you just put all those projects together. It's like some of these things seem completely unrelated, but there is something that we're trying to get at. And I've actually taken to calling it. There's something, and maybe you disagree with this, but there's something about Bitcoin that makes it different to everything else, and it has that property. And most things don't. Like Gitcoin doesn't. Public goods network doesn't. They just don't have them. And I think it's something about this. Like I started kind of equating it to this thing that they've started to use, this term they're using over at 0x Park, which is autonomous worlds. And the description of the autonomous worlds is that they're things that have the ability to live independently of their creator. Like Uniswap doesn't feel like it could ever not be Hayden. And I think it's a hard property to create. And what's maybe really interesting is, imagine you could create it. Imagine you could like bottle it as a primitive, like your idea of flatness, right? Or zero. And once you've discovered it, you're like, oh, we can just recreate that. So yeah, that's where my head is. And I still don't know where that goes, but yeah, something there.
Yeah, I call that property being self-hosted. So
Self-hosted.
It's kind of like recursion, where it's like inverse recursion. So self-hosted is a term that comes from computer science, and it refers to programming languages that are written in themselves. So C, for example, I think C might have been the first self-hosted language. Maybe that's not true, but after they wrote the machine code, and then at some point the machine code was sufficient, the compiler was sufficient, that you could write a new compiler, but now in the language that you had defined. And so that, like, something about, like Bitcoin is your example of a system that is that has a self-hosted property, where it's the incentives itself that creates itself, and that those two things are identical, and that it almost feels like a paradox when you think about it, right? Because you're like, wait a second, it only exists because it exists. And then you're like, but wait, that's obvious. And then you're like, but wait, if you were to change anything about it, then it wouldn't exist anymore. And so I think that to me, that captures that notion. And I think that it's only one. You don't need to have a system that's self-hosted for it to be an inferent, but good, sufficiently advanced inference will be self-hosted, right? Because they'll be able to reason about themselves in order to change themselves.
Yeah, which I guess is something that's easier to reason about when you think about AI than when you think about other types of systems. Like organizations are dumb and don't have an ability to. They do have an ability to reason about themselves, I guess. Yeah, it's quite interesting. It's funny because, again, it's tough in this space to limit, I guess, which I was talking to you, what I explained is that there needs to be some limit, otherwise the term becomes useless. But there's the I don't even know where it comes from, this idea that the humans are just the universe understanding itself, like for the first time, or like being able to reason about itself. And I kind of guess that at some point there is this like idea that there's something we're trying to create, which is it's just kind of like life. Like you're trying to create something that by itself can sustain itself and doesn't require, which for me feels like the reason why, maybe there's a legal reason, but maybe why Kevin is so adamant that he is distancing himself from Gitcoin. He is not Gitcoin. I think it's that property he's trying to embody in Gitcoin, and that it doesn't need him. Even though, like, I think there's a lot of work that he's having to do behind the scenes to make it run and operate smoothly. So,
I do think there are complicating factors, but I don't know anything specific.
Neither do I. Yeah, neither do I.
But yeah, I think you're right. I think you're absolutely right. That it's part of the story for sure. He's trying to make it self-hosted, but I agree with you that it's and I think all things start requiring a founder boost. But not all things can end without founder intervention. And I think like there's an ambition to design systems that can.
Yeah, I agree with that. I do agree with that. It's a fascinating like space to explore. I wonder if there's a conclusion, because I always say to Alex, I like, for example, the way that we've been approaching it is we came up with an idea, we went to speak to VCs, they loved the idea, they loved the space, they think that we're doing something useful, they funded us, and then we stopped. We said, okay, we're not going to work on that idea now. We're going to spend some time looking at every other possible idea we could focus on the basis that if the idea we're working on fails, we'll probably end up in one of these ideas anyway. So it's worth seeing if any of those ideas are better. And that's been really useful. And I think it's got us here quite quickly. Remains to be seen where we end up, but I think it's been a good process. And yeah, I just wonder if there's a way to ask ourselves whether this has a use. Does this have a good conclusion? Like, is there something about blockchains that allows us to do things that we previously couldn't? If there is, can we isolate that thing? Can we be specific about it? Like, what is it that we have that we didn't have before? And there's maybe something around coordination costs, right? Really, or like it'd be ability to enforce agreements using mathematics rather than people. There's like blockchain hardness, property. Maybe there's something there. And then there's the like, for example, I was saying, Alex and I were having this conversation. Is public goods network enough? Like, could you just say optimism, retro public goods funding plus PGN doing like this like contract, whatever it's called, contract something financing. Is that enough to fund all public goods in the world? Because if you just see optimism as being like the suburbs of Ethereum, and they're offloading lots and lots and lots, or like the Optimism superchain is offloading a ton of the transactions that would go through Ethereum mainnet, and everything's now going through R2s. So they're picking up all this traffic and they're taxing all of that through transaction fees. And a ton of that, they say the majority is going towards retro PGF. Plus you have PGN, and everyone's deploying to PGN, and all of the fees or some percentage of the fees are then being allocated to public goods. Is that enough to fund all the public goods that we may want in the world? Like, and I think it's probably a reasonable question to ask yourself. Like, that might be enough, because that's something that we see in the real world, right? We have taxation. Taxation is allowing us to fund public goods. There's a question as if it allows us to fund enough public goods. And there's always the problem that at the core, the decision is a political decision, and largely it's something driven by like private interests. And so that's why normally you get underfunding of public goods anyway, even if it's done via taxation. So there's a question as to, like, with two really interesting things. Retro PGF is a discretionary model, right, where you have people coming together and making a decision. And I would say that the problem with Retro PGF is that there's no who decides who gets the Citizens House tokens, right? Who gets those votes? So that's like that is actually the power process, because whoever's distributing those tokens is the person who is in power. They're making the decision, not the deciders. And then, but then with Public Goods Network, you have a mechanistic model, right? Which is just the more gas that people spend using your application, the more like funding you get. And again, that's gameable, but at least it's fair, right? It's just gas. Like, if people use it and they spend a lot of gas, I guess that's what, like, but then you can imagine people designing these very, very like inefficient gas consuming apps that are really fun or maybe even addictive, because they can just print money doing that. So it's going to be really interesting watching those two things. And my sense, my kind of like quick take is just that I feel like those are just also very highly inefficient. Like, those are two forms of taxes, and that doesn't necessarily mean that there's not other better forms of tax to fund public goods. But they're all taxes.
Yep. Yeah. So maybe we start at the beginning of that, where you say, what is it that crypto is doing that's new? And the trite answer is that it is an elaborate tool for block ordering. At least that's what blockchains are doing, is that it's an elaborate tool for block ordering. And what that means is that, like, the primitive that it gives us is it gives us non-counterfeitable tokens, right? And from my perspective, that's it. Like, like the only primitive that you get out of crypto are non-counterfeitable tokens. And everybody who's tried to make more of this is diluting themselves. Everybody who's tried to make less of this is also diluting themselves. They try and say, well, non-counterfeitable tokens aren't that interesting, and they're extremely interesting. Now there's other things in crypto, like older technologies like CRDTs, and they don't give you block ordering, but they give you eventual consistency, right? And so you don't get the ordering, so you can't use these for non-counterfeitable tokens, right? They don't solve the Byzantine generals problem, but you can use them for other things like shared databases, right? And because they don't care about ordering quite as much, they just care about eventual consistency, then you can have certainty that your messages aren't being censored, but you can't necessarily prove when they happened. And most of the time when they happened is not as valuable of information as the fact that they were seen by other people, right? That they eventually happened. So for example, this is like the Mosquito protocol is another example of a protocol that makes a similar trade-off. It says, we don't care about the message arriving at a certain time or in a certain order. We don't care how many times it arrives even, we just care that it arrives, right? So that's MQTT and its trade-offs. And so I think that is an example of a mechanism set that gives us like some sort of utility. And the utility here is that you can't have that you can know the order in which these happen. You can't have counterfeited coins. And I think that in general, the reason that it's interesting is because self-hosting is easier to achieve. You know, this property of Bitcoin is easier to achieve using mechanisms than it is using math, using like the most simple assumptions and primitives instead of involving humans, right? So if you and I were elected to run the world, then everybody would have to worry about whether or not you and I are good people. And they do all this inference on us and how are we likely to behave? And is there any way that we could be like made a little bit crazy? Could we get Alzheimer's as we get older, right? All this stuff. Whereas like, it's much easier to trust a mechanism because you can kind of like finish your analysis of a mechanism, whereas you can't finish your analysis of a person. And so this is why like Amazon is not going to last as long as Bitcoin is, because Amazon is filled with people and eventually those protocols are going to change and mutate and break down. But the Bitcoin protocol is going to run for a very, very, very long time. And so I think that that's the opportunity of, I mean, you say that like, are chains enough to fund all public goods? And I think the answer is no. We know this because, you know, the list of public goods is extremely long. So, you know, what you would need to convince someone of is that the entire, military budget of the United States could be funded using chains. And I think the answer is no, right? And we know that we want some sort of defense, either as from against one another, whether that's owned by the United States or not is its own kind of question, right? Yeah. But we know that we want to prevent rogue nations or whatever from threatening us with nuclear weapons. And so what that means is that, and if you don't want to accept that public good, then pick any other one: roads and highways and air traffic control and lighthouses, right? Can we fund all of these just with chains? And hopefully it seems pretty clear that the answer is like, no, that's not going to happen.
Yeah. Well, I also feel like the counter to that is, if you had more funds available for funding public goods, you just end up with more public goods. Effectively, it's constrained by the amount of funding available, not the other way around.
That's right. I think that's exactly right. I think that it's like a bet that I would make is that now I can't tell how the efficiency story works because I think they're related to one another. I think like the total funding that we allocate for public goods is also smaller in part because of the inefficiency of our delivery of public goods. If we became twice as efficient at delivering public goods, I don't think that public goods funding would fall, I think it would rise, because everybody would have a higher expectation that they're going to get more for their buck, right? That it was worth it.
Yep, pretty much. Yeah.
So then that gets us to this question of, like, as you say, there's two approaches, which is there's one that requires a governance that creates a governance problem, like retro PGF. And it's like, well, who gets to control where those tokens go and how? And there's another that's mechanistic, which says, okay, we're just going to define up front basically a Bitcoin-like protocol for how to distribute these funds. And everybody's going to be able to complete their inference on it, and it just becomes a game that they learn how to play. But then it might have some limitations, right? It might not it might not cover all possible public goods, or it might require extra work or something like this. And so I think that the answer is not to it's not just a mechanism, not just a simple mechanism, and it's not just governance, but rather it's mechanistic governance. And if we can solve the problem of mechanistic governance, then we will have addressed that we'll have a product, for example, to sell to Optimism, to sell to Retro PGF, to sell to these DAOs, potentially even to sell to companies if this thing is efficient enough, which then allows them to fund more, right? More public goods through various different means, more dynamically. And because it's mechanistic, it can be trusted. And so it will allow itself to be self-hosted. And so we'll get all the benefits of, a blockchain like minimalist mechanistic set, which can scale beyond us, without needing to, without all the downsides of it being based on us as charismatic personalities. I think, like, for example, your charismatic personality is necessary for the early days. But obviously, eventually we want to work ourselves out of the role. So yeah, what's your response to that?
I think that the mechanistic governance is the original. It's actually the original pitch for Butter. It's like we said we're designing a DAO or protocol to govern DAOs. Like, we actually always said we're not designing a DAO, so to speak, and we're not designing a piece of software to sell to DAOs. We're not designing governance systems to sell to DAOs, and we're also not designing a one-for-one replacement for like Governor Bravo or Governor Alpha. We're designing a protocol that governs DAOs. So you can think about our DAO protocol being comprised mostly of agents who do governance in DAOs, where people are free to enter or leave our governance system by staking tokens. So I take my token, I have 10 uni, I can vote directly, but instead I can put them inside Blackbox or Butter, and then I get some like greater utility from a governance perspective. So and that's entirely because it's just it's a mechanism that's like, we just said, it's augmenting the incentives in some way. That means that all participants are strictly better off in our system than they are in the kind of vanilla system. And that was it. We kind of said, like, that's broadly what we have. And then we designed a very simple model, and we put that out there with Aave, and it kind of like worked, I guess. And now we've just been kind of exploring the solution space. But I think we kind of defined the solution, but we're kind of exploring the problem space to make sure that the problems are accurate, and then trying to kind of iterate through the solution space. So I think I do agree with you that this kind of like idea of mechanistic governance is one way of thinking about it. The other way we've thought about it is that, putting my keep it simple, stupid hat on and looking at like Griff, Griff Green. He has this talk. I think I mentioned it last time, and I was just thinking, he says something in there which is just really straightforward, which is like one of the really interesting things you can do is you can just issue tokens. That's like one solution, right? So you can imagine some sort of like we call it state DAO, which is just, it's not doing anything really from a governance perspective, like, or from a mechanism perspective. It is, but it's not complex. It's just saying, I'm a DAO, and anytime anybody buys one of my tokens, I'm going to use the proceeds. I'm going to sell you a token. I'm going to use the proceeds to buy a governance token of a public goods protocol. And so there, what you have, and this is one thing I think is really interesting about what PGN are doing, and also what Retro PGF is doing. So if I say, if you come to my protocol, I will buy tokens with the money you put into it, then you could say this is similar to Gitcoin in that it only really attracts altruists. But I think that what you're also saying is like you're carving out people who only want to fund public goods, like they want to fund them, and so they're buying up Butter tokens, and then the proceeds of the treasury are being used to buy governance tokens. So what that's doing is it's basically like kind of creating like a floor for governance tokens. It's consistently saying it's a commitment to continually fund public goods with anyone who buys a token. That's what we're going to do with the proceeds. And I like this because it's just saying that the value value that the system. Sorry, go on.
Why wouldn't they just buy the governance tokens directly, or I'm sorry, the protocol tokens directly?
Mostly because of the decision, I guess, of what to fund. So it'd be like saying, why don't people just buy I don't know, like, why don't you just go and invest in Apple directly rather than investing in like Vanguard? And I'd say, well, it's because of the portfolio. You wanna have a exposure to multiple things. So you could say that there's an element of Uniswap that's a public good. There's an element of Gitcoin that's public good. And maybe there's some sense of like how much of that should be bought and how much of that should be funded. And again, I'm only saying try and like come up with a very simple version of the solution. And I thought this was quite interesting just because I feel like at some level, all that PGN is doing is it's just isolating the group of people who want to fund public goods. Because if you don't want to fund public goods, then you probably shouldn't build on PGN. And if you want to be, let's say that they decentralize the sequencer, then any validator there, they're being taxed, right, for validating on that network. So they could go elsewhere, like to Arbitrum, where there's no tax. They're just paying the fee, or they're collecting the fee, collecting the revenue, and they're like strictly better off. So again, in this market, I'm kind of like, you're talking about voluntary taxation, right? Like, so people have to opt into being taxed. So obviously most people are going to try and maximize their own returns. They're going to opt out of PGN. The only reason they go there is if a lot of developers build there and a lot of people, a lot of users go there. So like if they deploy Uniswap there and lots of users go to Uniswap on PGN rather than somewhere else, then they're picking PGN for some reason because they want to fund public goods with their gas fees. And then the developers are there because they know people want to fund public goods with their gas fees, and then the validators turn up because they're like, well, there's some money to collect here, I might as well collect it. And so, but what it feels like is that is just isolating the group of society who thinks it's worth funding public goods. And so could you just more directly just say like, hey, we're funding public goods, come here, let's give us your money, and we'll go buy public goods tokens or fund public goods.
Yeah, but the trick there is that it converts the public good into a club good, right? Because it's part of a network. And so the advantage of PGN is that there are ways to exclude people from the benefits, from the network effects, by writ of the fact that if you're on the network, then you get all the access to all the network effects and you pay taxes. But if you're not on the network, then you don't get all the benefits. I mean, you'll get like the read, you'll get the read-only benefits. You'll be able to see what happened on chain, but you won't get the writing benefits. And so I think that's the distinction. And I think that's the general solution to the problem of funding for public goods is you figure out how to convert them into club goods. I mean, like literally the way that the United States government converts it into a club good is you either get to live freely and pay your taxes, or you go to jail. So you benefit from the fact that and of course there's some steps between actually going to jail, but you know, there's some localized cost for you. There's a way in which the costs are localized to you if you don't participate in the game. And I think that like we will know we have made moral progress, and meaning that we have designed a better mechanism set if we can fund public goods to significant levels without needing to resort to such intense coercion, right?
So I guess maybe this is the axis on which the whole argument flips, because you said something which is the way we solve public goods problems is we convert them to club goods.
Mhm.
Uniswap is as a club good. I think there's lots of things being built on Ethereum that are club goods, and absolutely not non-excludable. They're excludable, very excludable.
And most of them actually have dimensions in which they are public goods, club goods, private goods. Yeah.
Agreed. Yeah, absolutely agreed. Like liquidity is very different to like price feeds, which Uniswap tends to also act as. The thing I think is maybe that axis is coercion versus altruism. So I feel like there's some altruist component to PGN where there is technically no reason to ever use it unless you decide you want to fund public goods altruistically. So you're not being coerced. However,
well, but the thing to remember is that always altruism is valuable for group selection, right? And so if you are capable, like the tribe that believes in the one true God and the tribe that doesn't, the tribe that believes in the one true God is going to better be able to coordinate than the tribe that doesn't. The tribe that doesn't is going to fracture more easily. And so on the individual level, you know, perhaps like all the individualists in the tribe that doesn't believe in the one true God, they're going to you know, do better. But the tribe that believes in the one true God is going to outcompete on a group level. And then the question is just on that competition landscape, whether coordination has superlinear effects over and above individualism. And that's the definition of asking whether or not there are network effects, right? And so the question then is, will a network built with retro PGF tend to have collective benefits for everybody that's on it that will cause it to outcompete other chains, right? And so it's true that the initial participants miss out on a certain kind of like they might pay the founding fees, but also they're probably buying the tokens, right? In the early days. So they're also going to enjoy upside as early believers. And so if they really believe in the long-term capacity of the network to outcompete because of its ability to fund now what are club goods, then it's going to win. So always the story with altruism is that altruism isn't real. It's just the selfishness of the group.
Altruism is selfishness at the group level. So I would say that the interesting thing about PGN is that it's a club good at the group level, the network level, but not at the individual level, right? So if I deploy like a new game called like Space Cats on there, and it's like really fun to play, I don't charge anybody, but people play it a lot. Maybe it helps them to onboard to Ethereum, and I get paid, right? Maybe I get paid a lot. That's really useful for me. I'm technically still delivering a public good, like because it's free for anybody to use, but actually only if they opt into using the network. And so you could say that the product itself is still a public good, but it's in a scoped version of the public, which is what we call a club, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Anyway, we've gone in a as usual into like a very meandering conversation, which is always good. It's always very, very good. I wanted to make sure we had a good call.
I always feel like it's refining though for me. Like these conversations are great. And you know, I'll just say this over and over again, but I really feel like you're in contact with the problem in a way that I don't know if there's anybody else I know who's in contact with the problem like you. So it's awesome.
I have a lot of incentives to get it. No, agreed. I think when I listened to the podcast, I was in New York at the time. I was like, oh, I need to speak to Connor. I think he's